The lobby smelled of antiseptic and cold air pushed too hard through metal vents. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their white glare flattening every face into the same pallid tone. The floor was polished to a sterile shine, reflecting boots more clearly than expressions. Flags lined the far wall in symmetrical order, their fabric frozen in ceremonial folds. Beneath them hung framed commendations, rows of citations, medals mounted in glass, black and white photographs of men whose names were engraved into brass plates below, above the reception desk. Centered with bureaucratic precision, a plaque declared only the BST. The letters were raised, gold against navy blue. They caught the light. It did not blink. She stood beneath that sentence with her shoulders squared, boots aligned at regulation width. Her ID badge hung from a retractable cord, clipped to her chest pocket. It swayed slightly every time she breathed. The badge carried her photograph-neutral expression, hair pinned tight, eyes forward, permission encoded in plastic. The lobby was quiet except for the faint scuff of leather on tile and the mechanical click of a distant printer. 4 recruits waited in line, all of them silent, all of them pretending not to measure one another. The supply door opened with a hydraulic sigh. A staff sergeant stepped out carrying a long, black rifle case. He did not look at her first. He looked past her. The men. "Receive your issued platform," he said, voice clipped procedural. "Inspect. Confirm serial. Move." The first recruit stepped forward. The case opened. Inside lay a modern precision rifle matte finish, adjustable stock optic mounted with clean symmetry. The scope's glass caught the fluorescent light and reflected it back like a small private sun. Polished boots pivoted. Paperwork exchanged hands. A nod. The second recruit received the same. The third. The ritual repeated with mechanical indifference. Equipment was not merely equipment here. It was expectation. It was investment. It was a prediction of return. When her turn came, the staff sergeant did not reach for a black case. He turned instead toward a metal rack against the wall. The rifle he removed was older, with stock darkened by oil and time. The finish had thinned along the grip where other hands had rested. No optic mounted, only iron sights, small, fixed, unadorned. The sling was worn at the edges, fibers feathering outward. He held it horizontally. "For inspection, as though presenting surplus inventory, this will be yours." No explanation followed. The fluorescent light above flickered once. She stepped forward and accepted the weight without hesitation. The rifle was heavier than the others, not in mass, but in implication. She felt the uneven texture of the wood. Against her palm, the front sight post stood bare against the white ceiling, small and unapologetic. Behind her, one of the recruits shifted his stance. Leather creaked. She did not turn. The staff sergeant extended a clipboard. Sign. Her ID badge swung forward as she bent slightly to write her name. The badge tapped once against the rifle stock. Plastic against wood. Permission against proof. The pen moved cleanly across the paper. Problem? The staff sergeant asked, though his tone suggested he expected one. "No, Sergeant." The answer was level, not defiant, not grateful. He studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded once and turned away. The line dissolved. Cases snapped shut. Boots crossed tile in different directions. She remained standing with the rifle in her hands, aware of the geometry of the room. The flags did not shift. The plaque did not change. Only the best. The words hovered above, heard like an administrative verdict. A lieutenant entered from the corridor beyond, his posture crisp with habitual authority. His gaze swept across the recruits, pausing briefly on her rifle. His jaw tightened, not in surprise, but in confirmation. He said nothing. Silence here was not absence. It was architecture. She moved toward the exit that led to the range yard. The automatic doors parted with a muted hiss. Cold air replaced conditioned sterility. Gravel crunched underfoot. The sky outside was a flat, disciplined gray. Recruits were already inspecting their optics, adjusting turrets with delicate clicks. glass lenses tilted toward the horizon, fingers traced calibration marks. She did not adjust anything. She brought the rifle to her shoulder once, testing the balance. The iron sights aligned naturally when she exhaled. The rear aperture framed the distant berm in a tight circle. No magnification. No distortion, just distance, honestly measured. One of the recruits glanced sideways. "You're running irons?" he asked quietly. "Yes, a beat." "That's what they gave you?" "Yes." He looked at her rifle again, then at his own, as though comparing eras rather than tools. He did not offer sympathy. He did not need to. The disparity was visible. The wind shifted across the yard, lifting a corner of a range flag. The fabric snapped once, sharply like a reprimand. An instructor emerged onto the concrete platform overlooking the lanes. His boots were mirror bright, reflecting the gray of the sky. "You shoot what you're issued," he called out. "The target doesn't care about your excuses." His gaze lingered on her position for a fraction of a second longer than on the others. The message was clean. Institutions do not explain themselves. They allocate. She adjusted her stance in the gravel, pressing her boots firmly into the uneven ground until they felt anchored. The rifle sling brushed against her sleeve. The woodstock rested against her collarbone with solid familiarity. The others lifted rifles crowned with glass. Small suns pointed downrange. She lifted iron. The fluorescent hum of the lobby felt distant now, but its residue remained, cold, clinical, orderly. A system of corridors and clipboards and plaques. A place where worth was suggested before it was tested. The rifle in her hands was not an accident. It was a hypothesis behind the concrete walls. Beyond the flags and framed honors, beyond the lobby polished to a sterile sheen, there existed a machinery older than any individual inside it, a mechanism that sorted, predicted, distributed advantage. With the quiet confidence of precedent, only the best. The phrase did not mean what it claimed. It meant, if we decide first. Performance would come later. She tightened her grip slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. The iron sights stood narrow and unadorned against the open, field honest, unforgiving. She did not look back at the building. The wind moved again, carrying the faint scent of oil and dust around her. Optics glinted under the gray sky like promises. Already kept in her hands rested something else. Not disadvantage, a measure. The range was built to mute emotion. Concrete blast walls divided the firing lanes into narrow corridors of focus. Gravel swallowed footsteps. The sky stretched low and metallic above the berm, pressing down like a lid. Wind flags stood at measured. Intervals downrange red triangles clipped to thin poles, snapping and falling, slack with disciplined irregularity. The first volley cracked through the morning sound did not echo here. It struck and died against reinforced surfaces. Brass casings spun into the air and fell to the gravel with small metallic taps, scattering like minor verdicts beside polished boots. She lay prone in lane 6. The old rifle settled into her shoulder, pocket as though it belonged there. The woodstock carried the faint scent of oil warmed by friction. Her cheek rested against it without hesitation. The iron sights cut a narrow geometry into the horizon rear aperture, framing the front post. Front post resting at the base of the distant silhouette target. Around her, optics adjusted. Click, click, click. Small calibrations of advantage. She inhaled once, slow, let half of it leave her body, held the remainder in suspension. The first shot broke clean. The recoil was firm but honest. Pushing back into her collarbone, the casing arced up and away. The steel silhouette downrange answered, a half-second later with a sharp, confirming ring. She did not move immediately. She watched the wind flag to lanes over twitch left, and settled second shot another ring. The instructor on the platform made a notation on his clipboard without lifting his head. Numbers were impartial. They did not applaud a vehicle engine. Idled somewhere behind the concrete perimeter, it cut off abruptly. The door closed with deliberate restraint. He walked onto the platform without announcement. The man wore no visible decoration beyond a subdued, trident pin on his chest, gold dulled. To Matt Bayou's, His uniform sleeves were rolled precisely, forearms marked faintly by old sun and older strain. His boots were not polished for ceremony, were maintained for function. He carried a rifle slung across his back, longer than the issued platforms. On the line, a scope mounted atop it extended like a measured promise. The glass caught the pale sun and held it without glare. He removed his sunglasses and scanned. The lanes, he did not smile. The other instructors shifted subtly in posture, not deferential. Acknowledging, she saw him only in peripheral fragments. At first, the outline against concrete, the steady pace of his stride as he moved behind the firing line, another volley. More brass struck gravel. He stopped behind. Lane 4 watched, moved on. Lane 5, brief pause. Lane 6, her she had just completed a 5-shot string. The iron sights dipped slightly as she reset her breath. Grouping on the target visible through the spotting scope mounted near the instructor's station was tight. Center mass, slightly high left. Consistent in its deviation, the wind had shifted. Mid-dash string, he stepped closer. Close enough that she could feel the difference in shadow across her back. Distance? He asked. His voice was even stripped of. Ornament, 300 yards, sir. Wind, quartering right. 5 to 7. A pause, and you're holding? Half post left. He did not respond immediately. The wind flag at 100 yards snapped hard, then fell slack. She adjusted the front sight fractionally, a movement so small it barely disturbed the line of her shoulders. Shot steel rang again. He looked toward the spotting scope. Leaned slightly, just enough to confirm what he had already calculated. The grouping held no optic, no magnification, iron and instinct. He straightened. Around them, other recruits shifted to compensate for drift they had not anticipated. Scopes turned again. Click, click, one lane over. A shot struck low. Kicking dust from the berm, he remained behind her for another string. 5 rounds. 5 impacts. Her breathing did not change. When the ceasefire was called, rifles lifted from shoulders in near unison. Chambers cleared.
Ow.
Bolts locked back. The smell of burnt powder hung low and metallic in the air. Recruits stood and stepped back from their lanes. She rose last, brushing gravel from her elbows with efficient movements. The rifle sling hung across her chest. Her ID badge rested against the wood stock again, tapping lightly as she adjusted her posture. He faced her directly now. Up close, his expression was not stern. It was measured. Eyes that had spent years narrowing distance between intention and outcome. That platform standard issue? He asked. Yes, sir. No optic offered? No, sir. Silence after her answer was not awkward. It was evaluative. He nodded once, almost to himself. Your hold was consistent. Yes, sir. A beat. You compensate early? Yes, sir. That was all. No praise. No correction. He stepped away, moving toward the instructor with the clipboard. Their exchange was quiet, words lost beneath the scrape of boots and the clatter of rifles being racked. She did not strain to listen. Recognition was not validation. She understood the difference. Across the yard, recruits compared targets, voices low but animated. One laughed too loudly, relief disguised as confidence. She walked toward the water station at the edge of the range. The gravel shifted under her. Wait with a sound like restrained applause. Behind her, he paused near the spotting scope again. The sun emerged briefly from behind a layer of cloud, striking the lens of his rifle's scope. For a moment, it reflected the world-inverted sky below, ground above. Figures reduced to silhouettes, then the light passed. He adjusted nothing on his own weapon. He did not need to fire to measure. The range reset for another cycle. Targets reeled. Inward on mechanical tracks, paper replaced, steel repainted in dull gray. Systems preferred repetition. It reinforced hierarchy, it confirmed expectation. Yet precision had a way of disturbing those calculations. From the platform he watched as she returned to lane 6 without hesitation, settling back into the gravel with the same deliberate calm. The old rifle rested against her shoulder like a continuation of bone around her. Optics gleamed again. He folded his arms. There were always two forces inside institutions like this: the visible structure and the unseen judgment of those who operated within it. Policies declared neutrality. Equipment implied preference, but performance was a fact, and facts, when repeated often enough, could become dissent. The wind shifted once more across the yard, tugging at the red flags in uneven rhythm. Concrete absorbed the noise. Brass collected in small, shining clusters at each firing point. From above, the scene would have appeared orderly lanes aligned, figures prone, instructors observing with procedural detachment. A system functioning as designed. Yet in Lane 6, iron sights cut clean lines through the air where glass was expected to intervene. He saw it clearly, and seeing, here was an act, not dramatic, public, but necessary. Qualification day did not begin with noise. It began with paper. Clipboards were arranged along a folding table inside the range control building. Each sheet squared neatly beneath a metal clamp. Names typed in uniform font. Score spaces empty. Columns waiting to become verdicts. The room resembled a hearing chamber more than a training facility. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, unwavering and cold. The walls were bare concrete, painted a shade that refused warmth. A digital clock above the doorway counted seconds in red numerals, different to human pulse. Boots lined up along the tiled floor. She stood among them. The old rifle slung across her chest. The sling's fabric had thinned where friction had worn it down over years of prior use. It lay against her shoulder like something inherited rather than issued. Across the room, recruits inspected their optics one last time. Click. Click turrets rotated with careful precision. Scope caps snapped open and closed. Glass lenses caught. The overhead lights, reflecting sterile rectangles of white, she did not adjust anything. Her iron sights required no calibration beyond the alignment of breath and intention. She ran a cloth once along the wooden stock knot to polish it, but to clear a thin layer of dust gathered from the range yard. The motion was quiet, almost ceremonial. An instructor stepped forward to brief the course of fire. His tone carried procedural gravity. 3 distances. Timed strings. Wind holds at your discretion. Scores will be recorded immediately. No reshoots. No inflection. No encouragement. This was not practice. This was record. They moved outside in formation. Gravel compressed under synchronized weight. The wind was steady but not violent, a lateral pressure that required attention but not fear. Range flags extended. Halfway, trembling in controlled tension, targets stood at measured intervals, downrange paper silhouettes clipped to wooden frames, white against the earth berm. The centers were marked by faint circular, scoring rings that would fold inward under impact. Like testimony under cross-examination, she took her position in Lane 6 again. The old rifle settled into her shoulder with familiar gravity. She lowered herself into prone, elbows anchored into gravel, boots flat, toes angled outward for stability. The sling pressed lightly against her upper arm, taut but not restrictive around her. Bipods snapped open. Metal legs bit into dirt. Optics aligned. She inhaled. The first command came sharply. Commence fire. The range fractured into controlled violence. Rifles cracked in staggered sequence. Brass flew. Dust lifted in small abrupt clouds where shots missed, center mass. She exhaled halfway and held the rest suspended. The front sight post steadied against the silhouette's chest. Pressure on the trigger not pulled, but increased. Incremental, deliberate. The break surprised no one but the air. Recoil pressed into bone. The casing spun free. A heartbeat later, the paper target twitched and folded inward at the center ring. A clean puncture collapsing fibers toward the middle. She reset. Breath again. Wind flag flicker. Minor correction. Second shot. Another fold inward. Around her optics, shifted frantically as wind pushed harder than expected. Clicks sounded more urgently now, like arguments made too late. An instructor behind the line called out, adjust for drift. She already had. Third shot, fourth, fifth each. Impact compressed the target's center until the paper seemed to cave toward itself, collapsing under accumulated precision. The first string ended. Cease fire. A bolts locked back in metallic unison. She remained prone for a moment longer than necessary, feeling her pulse slow against the wood stock. Not adrenaline. Control. When she stood, she did not look toward the observation platform. The instructors moved downrange to inspect targets. Boots crunched along gravel. Clipboards lifted. Pens hovered. They began at lane 1, murmured numbers. Occasional correction. Lane 3 produced a tight grouping. Slightly low. Lane 4 widespread. Lane 5 solid. Wind dash worn. Lane 6. The instructor stopped. He leaned closer to the paper, as though proximity might reveal flaw. The center ring was nearly obliterated. 5 rounds, nested within a space smaller than regulation demanded. The edges of the holes overlapped. Fibers bent inward. A small dark cavity formed at the heart of the silhouette. The instructor straightened. He wrote the score without comment. When they returned to the firing line for the second distance, the wind increased. Range flags extended fully now, snapping in irregular bursts. Dust trailed low across the berm. Recruits adjusted optics. Again, she adjusted nothing but breath. The command came. Fire resumed. At extended distance, sound altered. The crack of rifles remained immediate. The impact of rounds against steel silhouettes beyond the paper targets arrived, delayed, metallic, and distant. A half-second echo of confirmation. Her shots rang true. Not dramatic. Measured, the rhythm of her breathing became the metronome of the range. Inhale, half. Release, pressure. Break. A spent casing struck her forearm and fell into the gravel, hot. Against skin, she did not flinch. By the final string, tension had thinned into something sharper. Instructor stood closer now. Clipboards clutched with less casual posture. The last command was given. She fired. 5. 5 confirmations. Silence followed. Not the procedural silence of a ceasefire, a different one. Recruits rose. Chambers cleared. Targets were reeled. Inward on mechanical tracks. Paper fluttered as it approached the line. Perforations visible even before full inspection. Her target stopped in front of her. The center was gone. Not raced collapsed. A tight cluster where independent holes had merged into one decisive absence. An instructor cleared his throat. Score, he said quietly to the man beside him. Numbers were written. The Navy SEAL instructor stood at the edge of the platform, arms folded, watching without spectacle. His face did not change, but his gaze lingered not on the paper, on her posture. The steadiness with which she rested the rifle at her side, the absence of visible triumph. Around her, other recruits avoided looking directly at lane 6. No one applauded, no one needed to. The digital scoreboard mounted near the control building flickered as data was entered. Names aligned in descending order. Scores appeared beside them in stark numerals. Her name moved upward, then stopped at the top. The numbers were irrefutable. They carried no narrative, no sympathy, no correction. They replaced assumption with arithmetic. Yet prejudice does not vanish under calculation. It recalibrates. The wind continued across the yard, indifferent to hierarchy. Concrete walls absorbed the absence of commentary. Flags snapped once more and fell slack. From above, the scene resolved into order again. Lanes aligned, recruits dismissed, instructors gathering paperwork, system documenting its own surprise. On the scoreboard, her name remained in the highest position, its glowing red against gray casing. Numbers had replaced doubt for the moment, but numbers alone do not dismantle belief. They simply refuse to bend to it. The meeting room was smaller than the lobby, but colder. Frosted glass sealed it off from the corridor, turning movement outside into vague silhouettes without identity. The overhead lighting was recessed into the ceiling, one panel flickering, faintly at irregular intervals. As if uncertain whether to fully commit to illumination, a long rectangular table dominated the space. Its surface was clean to the point of sterility. At each seat lay a folder cream-colored cardstock, corners sharp, names typed in uniform black ink. Her rifle leaned against the wall beside the door untouched, with stock angled slightly outward. Iron sights pointed toward nothing in particular. It looked older here, removed from gravel and wind, placed against institutional beige like an artifact set down in the wrong century. She sat at the far end of the table, her ID badge rested against her sternum, motionless now. Exact. Hands folded once on the tabletop, shoulders squared but not rigid. She did not fill the silence. The officers entered in sequence. A lieutenant colonel first, ribbons aligned in a tight, colorful grid across his chest. Then a major with a legal pad already open, pen uncapped. Finally, the range commander, who closed the door softly behind him, the latch clicking into place with a sound to final for comfort. The last to enter was the Navy SEAL instructor. He took a seat halfway down the table, neither beside her nor across from her. His presence altered the air without announcing itself. He set no folder in front of him. The lieutenant colonel cleared his throat. "Recruit," began, voice modulated for authority rather than volume. "Your qualification results have been reviewed." A pause. "Your performance exceeded established benchmarks." He let the words sit. They were accurate but reluctant. The major's pen began tapping lightly against his folder. Tap, tap. The rhythm was not impatient. It was contemplative, metronome for doubt. However, the lieutenant colonel continued, "There are broader considerations." The flickering ceiling panel pulsed once, dimming the room by a fraction before recovering. "Standards are not solely numerical," he said. "They involve integration, cohesion, optics." The word lingered. Optics. Across the room, the old rifle remained angled against the wall, iron sights unblinking. The range commander folded his hands on the table. "Issuing outdated equipment was an allocation decision," he said carefully. "Resources are prioritized based on projected return." Projected return. The language was antiseptic. It's designed to avoid accusation while delivering it. She did not shift in her chair. "With respect, sir," she said, voice even, "I shot what I was issued." The pen stopped tapping. The lieutenant colonel studied her as if recalculating something intangible. "This isn't about the rifle," he said. "It was entirely about the rifle." The Navy SEAL instructor leaned back slightly in his chair. His boots remained flat on the floor. His gaze moved once toward the weapon by the door, then back to the officers at the head of the table. "It is about the rifle," he said. His tone was not confrontational. It was declarative. The room adjusted around that sentence. The major resumed, tapping his pen slower now. "The concern," the lieutenant colonel replied, "is perception within the unit. Standards must appear consistent." "Consistent with what?" the SEAL asked. A silence followed. The flickering light buzzed faintly. Overhead, with established pathways, the range commander offered, "Equipment assignments reflect readiness." "Or assumptions," the SEAL said. The word landed without force, but it did not move. The lieutenant colonel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're suggesting bias?" "I'm suggesting evidence," the SEAL replied, no elevation. In voice, no rhetorical flourish, just fact. The folders on the table contained her scores, her background, her evaluation notes, numbers aligned neatly in columns. Performance rendered into data. It was all there, undeniable and unsentimental. Yet the conversation circled not around numbers, but around comfort. "Unit cohesion matters," the major said finally. "Deviation from expected structure can create friction." "Capability reduces friction," the SEAL said. "Not the field, nothing else does." The pen stilled again. Her rifle remained untouched by the wall, a relic they had assumed, an inconvenience. Now it was evidence, quiet but present. The lieutenant colonel leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced across his midsection. "No. One is questioning her ability," he said. They were. "Institutional trust is built on predictability," he continued. We cannot afford destabilizing variables. She felt the weight of that phrase settle across the table. Destabilizing variable. Her ID badge rested flat against her chest. The photograph staring outward in bureaucratic neutrality. With respect, she said again, I qualified at the highest score. The statement was not defensive. It was surgical. The range commander's eyes shifted briefly toward the SEAL. He spoke for the first time in several minutes. She did. The ceiling light flickered once more, dimming and brightening. In hesitant rhythm, the SEAL leaned forward slightly now, forearms resting on the table. You issued her an outdated platform, he said. She compensated without complaint. She outperformed recruits with superior equipment. He paused. That is cohesion. Silence followed, not argumentative, calculating. The lieutenant colonel looked at the folder before him, as though it might produce a different answer under prolonged scrutiny. It did not. Outside the frosted glass, a shadow passed down the corridor. Anonymous movement within a larger machine. Institutions resist contradiction, not because they lack evidence, but because they fear precedent. If one assumption collapses, others may follow. The major cleared his throat. What are you proposing? The SEAL's gaze did not waver. Issue her the same equipment as every other top qualifier. A simple sentence. Revolution rarely announces itself loudly. The lieutenant. Colonel exhaled slowly through his nose. That would imply the initial allocation was flawed, the SEAL said. The word did not echo. It did not need to. The room tightened. The pen did not tap again. Her rifle leaned silently against the wall. Iron sights aligned toward the ceiling's uncertain light. Tradition sat heavier in that room than any weapon. It was embedded in protocols, in allocation decisions made before faces were attached to names. It lived in phrases like projected return and destabilizing, variable. But performance had entered the room. Swell in performance did not defer. The lieutenant colonel closed the folder in front of him with deliberate care. We will review the matter, he said, which meant the institution would consider adjusting without admitting error. The SEAL nodded once. She remained seated until dismissed. When the meeting ended, the chair slid back against the floor with controlled friction. The officers exited in sequence, their silhouettes dissolving behind the frosted glass. The SEAL paused near the door. He glanced at the rifle, then at her standards. He said quietly, are only as good as what they measure. He left without waiting for acknowledgement. She rose, retrieved the old rifle from the wall. The wood felt the same as it had that morning, solid, unadorned. Honest, the flickering ceiling panel dimmed once more before stabilizing completely. Beyond. The small meeting room, beyond the corridor and the lobby, and its plaque declaring only the best. There existed a defense apparatus vast enough to absorb dissent and slow enough to resist it. Tradition guarded its edges carefully, shaping reform into something less threatening before allowing it to pass. But pressure, applied repeatedly at the same point, alters structure. Inside a closed room, a small shift had begun. The door opened. The corridor stretched ahead, fluorescent and orderly. She walked forward, carrying the rifle they had not expected to matter. Word traveled without announcement. By mid-afternoon, the range held more observers than shooters. Instructors stood along the elevated platform in pressed uniforms. A pair of administrative officers occupied folding chairs brought out from the control building. Two senior enlisted men leaned against the concrete blast wall with their arms crossed, faces arranged into studied neutrality. No one called it a test, but a new target frame had been erected at 600 yards. The wind had sharpened since morning. It moved without apology across the open ground, snapping the Red Range flags until their fabric cracked like small whips. Dust lifted in low, restless sheets and slid along the berm. On a folding table near the firing line rested a long black rifle case. Inside it, visible to anyone who chose to look, lay a precision optic mounted in clean, professional alignment. On a modern rifle platform, the glass was immaculate. Turrets unscarred. Sunshade extended forward like a measured promise. Beside it, placed almost as an afterthought, lay her old rifle. Wood darkened by oil, iron sights fixed and spare. Unmounted scope rested between them on a folded cloth, detached, waiting. She stood a few feet away, boots planted firmly in the gravel. The ID badge at her chest caught a brief flash of sun before settling flat again. The lieutenant colonel approached first. "Oh, for clarity," he said, voice pitched for the gathered audience rather than for her. "You are authorized to use upgraded equipment." His hand gestured lightly toward the table. "Opportunity is available." The wind pressed against her uniform, tugging at loose fabric, pulling strands of dust into the air. She looked at the scope, then at the distant target barely. Visible at 600 yards, a pale shape against darker earth. Then back to the lieutenant colonel. "I'll use what I qualified with, sir." The words did not rise. They settled. A brief silence followed, stretching just long enough to register as resistance. The lieutenant colonel nodded once. "Very well." He stepped back. The Navy SEAL instructor stood apart from the others, arms folded loosely across his chest. His rifle remained slung behind him, unused. He did not speak. His gaze was steady, clinical, unblinking. She moved toward the table and lifted the old rifle. The sling slid across her shoulder with familiar friction. The wood stock rested against her collarbone, grounding her posture. The iron sights cut their narrow geometry through open air. The unmounted scope remained on the table, unused. Wind intensified, striking the range flags until they snapped fully horizontal. One pole vibrated against its mounting bracket with a faint metallic rattle. 600 yards, an instructor announced. 5 rounds. Your discretion, no countdown, no rehearsal. She lowered into prone position slowly, deliberately. Elbows anchored into gravel. Boots dug in behind her, toes pressing down until they found resistance beneath loose stone. Her breathing was visible, now uniform fabric expanding and contracting in measured rhythm. At this distance, the target was a suggestion more than a shape. The front sight post obscured much of it. There would be no magnified reassurance. Optical correction. Only wind. The first shot required patience. She waited through a full wind cycle, watching the nearest flag whip hard right, then ease. Half breath out. Pressure on the trigger increased gradually, almost imperceptibly. Break. The rifle recoiled into her shoulder, firm and honest. The casing spun free and struck the gravel. A long heartbeat passed. Then faint but unmistakable, steel answered from 600 yards away. A clear, distant ring. Murmurs shifted along the platform but did not rise above discipline. She did not look up. Second shot. The wind surged harder this time, pushing dust across the line. She adjusted her hold fractionally half-post more. Into the wind. Break. Another distant ring. The pace changed. Breath shortened slightly, not from nerves, but from momentum. Third. Shot. Ring. Fourth. Ring. The rhythm accelerated now, tension coiling tight around the observers. The air itself seemed thinner, pulled taut between rifle and steel. The fifth shot came faster than the rest. Wind gusted unexpectedly, snapping the nearest flag into violent extension. For a moment, the fabric blocked her peripheral vision entirely. She did not hesitate. Half breath. Pressure. Break. The recoil settled. Silence. The longest half-second of the afternoon stretched outward, expanding into the space between expectation and fact. Then ring, clear, indisputable. 5 impacts. No adjustment of glass. No recalibration of turrets. No borrowed advantage. Only iron and intention. She remained prone for a moment longer, cheek resting against wood that had absorbed the warmth of her skin. Her pulse slowed beneath her collarbone. Gravel pressed into her elbows with quiet insistence. When she rose, she did so without flourish. The lieutenant colonel's jaw tightened, though his expression did not otherwise change. One of the senior enlisted men shifted his stance, boots grinding softly against concrete. The unmounted scope still lay on the table, untouched. The Navy SEAL instructor stepped forward at last. He did not clap. He did not smile. He looked downrange once more, as if confirming the physics of what had just occurred. Then he turned his gaze to her. Single nod, small, precise. Recognition without spectacle. Range seemed quieter than before, though the wind had not relented. It tore at the flags, rattled loose gravel, pressed against uniforms with equal force. Instructors began speaking again, voices low and procedural. Data would be recorded, reports filed. The event reframed as confirmation rather than challenge, but something had shifted in posture along the platform. The system had offered accommodation as a concession, had declined. Mastery had no ornament today, no borrowed glass, no symbolic equalization, just proof. From above, the range appeared orderly as ever, lanes divided by concrete personnel, positioned at calculated intervals, flags marking invisible currents of air. A structure designed to evaluate and contain. Yet individual excellence, when undeniable, exerts pressure against containment. Institutions rely on predictability to maintain authority. They allocate advantage quietly, assuming outcome will justify distribution. But when outcome refuses alignment, the architecture strains. At 600 yards, 5 small impacts had traveled backward through wind and steel and gravel into something less visible but more rigid. The unmounted scope remained on the table, reflecting the pale afternoon sun, unused. Wind whipped the flags again, harder now. She stood with her boots planted firmly in gravel that shifted beneath everyone equally. Above the concrete blast walls, beyond the controlled geometry of the range, the sky stretched indifferent and wide. For a moment, the machinery of expectation faltered not in collapse, but in recalculation. Once begun does not easily stop. The lobby had not changed. Fluorescent lights hummed with the same mechanical indifference. The tile floor still held its sterile reflection, turning boots into dark silhouettes gliding across polished white. Flags stood in exact alignment along the far wall, their folds undisturbed by history or weather. Above the reception desk, the plaque remained fixed in its precise position, only the BST gold. Lettering against navy raised confident. When she stepped through the automatic doors, the air felt as controlled as it had the first morning. The scent of antiseptic lingered faintly beneath recycled ventilation. A printer clicked in the administrative office behind the desk. Spitting out paper with impersonal efficiency, her boots struck tile with measured rhythm. The old rifle was not slung across her shoulder today. It rested in her hands, freshly cleaned. The woodstock had been oiled to a subdued sheen, iron sights wiped free of carbon and dust. It looked less like surplus now and more like history. A clerk stood behind the counter with a thin folder open in front of him. "Recruit," he said, though the word no longer fit as cleanly as before. "Step forward." She did. Her ID badge hung against her chest, the plastic edges faintly scuffed from weeks of contact with rifle sling and uniform fabric. The photograph still displayed the same neutral expression, taken before any performance. Had recalibrated expectation, the clerk extended a hand. Badge. She unclipped it without ceremony. For a moment, the absence of its weight against her sternum registered physically like the removal of a small, constant pressure she had learned not to notice. The clerk replaced it with another. The new badge bore the same photograph, but beneath her name the designation had changed. Qualification status updated. Role expanded. Authorization codes altered. A minor administrative adjustment. He clipped it to her uniform with practiced hands. Effective immediately, said. No applause, no gathering, just documentation. Across the lobby, 2 recruits stood waiting for equipment assignment. One of them glanced toward her reflexively, then away. The other stared at the plaque above the desk, as if measuring himself. Against its promise, the clerk turned to the rifle. Serial number? She recited it. He entered the digits into a terminal. The screen reflected faintly in his glasses. A moment, the rifle's designation field read as it always had: legacy platform. Limited allocation. He paused. Sorrel led. Updated the classification. The rifle was re-logged. Training artifact. Demonstration platform. Authorized for instructional reference. Language shifted first in systems like this. Meaning followed later. He printed a receipt and slid it across the counter. Reassignment complete. She did not release the rifle immediately. Her hand remained on the woodstock for one breath longer than required. The sling, worn thin from years of use, rested against her knuckles like a line, drawn between past assumption and present fact. Footsteps approached from the corridor beyond. The lobby, the Navy SEAL instructor emerged without announcement, as he always did. His sleeves were rolled precisely. The trident pin at his chest caught the fluorescent light once before settling back into matte. He stopped beside her. His gaze lifted briefly toward the plaque. Only the best. The words had not changed, their definition. Had he looked at the rifle in her hands, then at the new badge against her chest? Designation fits, he said quietly. Yes, sir. Nodded once, the same restrained motion he had given on the range. No excess, no sentimentality. The platform didn't make you, he added. You made the platform relevant. The sentence settled into the sterile air with greater weight than any commendation. She inclined her head slightly, not submission, not pride, recognition. He turned to leave, boots striking tile in steady cadence. At the threshold of the corridor, he paused. Without looking back, he said, standards don't lower when someone meets them. They become real. Then he disappeared into the building's interior, where policy and precedent moved more slowly than wind across a range. The clerk closed the folder, administrative order restored. She stepped away from the counter, the new badge resting firmly against her chest. Its weight was identical to the previous one. Plastic and ink. Authority encoded in barcode and hologram. Yet it felt different across the lobby. One of the waiting recruits approached the desk. The supply door opened with its familiar hydraulic. Cy, a staff sergeant, emerged, carrying 2 cases, both black, both modern. He placed them on the counter without comment. No metal rack was consulted. No wooden stock retrieved from storage. The recruit hesitated only a fraction of a second before accepting his case. Small adjustments rarely announce themselves. As reform, they appear as procedure. She walked toward the exit doors. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, unchanged in pitch or tone. The flags remained fixed in ceremonial stillness. The plaque continued to declare its promise in raised gold letters. Only the best. This time, the words did not read as prediction. They read, as measurement, the automatic doors parted. Cold air entered. Gravel lay beyond the threshold, waiting to be disturbed by new boots. She stepped outside without looking back. Inside, the lobby resumed its quiet choreographic. Lipboards exchanged, badges printed, cases opened and closed. The machinery of selection continued to turn, methodical and self-assured. But somewhere within its rotation, a recalibration had occurred. The old rifle would rest now in controlled storage, logged not as relic, but as reference. Instructors would point to it during future briefings, recounting not theatrically, but accurately the day iron sights outperformed expectation. Documentation would reflect what performance had forced into record. Institutions resist change until evidence accumulates beyond dismissal. Then they absorb it, catalog it, and adjust just enough to preserve their shape. From above, the facility remained symmetrical and composed. Lobby-centered, range extending outward in disciplined lanes, concrete walls dividing effort into measured corridors. Yet beneath the fluorescent hum and procedural language, variable had shifted. A new recruit crossed the lobby threshold that afternoon. Boots striking tile with the same nervous precision she had once carried, his gaze lifted toward the plaque, absorbing its promise without irony. The supply door opened. Cases were brought forward. This time, no one turned toward the metal rack. The lights hummed on, and the system unchanged in appearance moved forward. With a slightly altered understanding of what it meant to deserve its own words,